a lot of the ongoing violence that we've seen on the rise towards um, Asian and Asian Americans in this country, and people of Pacific Islander descent. Also, get a nice perspective on what it's like being an Asian American in America today. Really good conversation. He also had a piece that I'll speak on, published in Politico. You really want to check that out. It's a really good read. The link to that will be in the description of this week's episode. So, with no further ado, Jeff Lee, let's go. Welcome to the No Room Talk Podcast. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. No Room to Talk Podcast. I am your host, Shaman. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Today, I have a special episode. I'll be joined today by Jeff Lee. Jeff was the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary for California Governor Jerry Brown. He has now moved on to being the Vice President of Public Policies and External Affairs for Rhino. But really what I wanted to talk to Jeff about was something that was really big that's going on in the world now with a lot of the hate and the racism that we're seeing towards Asian Americans. He wrote a piece that I really encourage everyone to go out and read. It's been posted in Politico Magazine, as also in the New York Times, USA Today. It's entitled, "I Thought I Knew How to Succeed as an Asian in U.S. Politics. Boy, Was I Wrong." So with no further ado, Jeff, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here, and flattery will get you everywhere. So it's a pleasure. Pleasure's all mine.
Awesome. So, just getting started off, this is one of the things I've never really gotten a chance to speak to anyone in politics before.
Sure.
Is that something like you always had like a yearning for, or is it something you found along the way?
Well, first off, I mean, when you go to the career fairs and you have dreams as a kid, it isn't like, oh, I want to work in an office. That's not really what it is. A lot of politics is working in an office and forwarding emails, right? But, as a little boy, I wanted to be an astronaut. That's what I wanted to do, right? And my childhood hero was Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. Okay. And actually, so much the case, I went to space camp when I was 9.5 years old. Oh, and got to meet her there. And I was like, I'm going to be an astronaut. You watch. And then years later, got to take classes with her. It was so cool. Here's the thing though, Shaman. I have terrible vision. I have flat feet like a penguin. And my math, despite my Asianness, is terrible. So math, physics, not my jam. And guess what? If you want to fly, you kind of have to be amazing at anything. I highly recommend the viewers and readers here to just check out like the latest NASA class of astronauts. It's like a combination of Top Gun meets Jeopardy champion meets Captain America and Black Panther with a touch of Hollywood. That's exactly how I would describe them. And servant warrior, put all that together. That's exactly what you get. I am far from that, right? But I'll tell you my interest in politics. It's something that is kind of a family connection, and less politics but more service. But that comes from my parents here. They were boat people from Vietnam. They escaped communism after the fall of Saigon in April of '75, and they hopped to different refugee camps across Asia and landed in California in 1981. I was born not too long after. And my family had a great sense of wanting to give back because they were so grateful that they could be here. And you learn very quickly coming from a culture where you have nothing to having something that you do want to give back, right? So I always knew that I wanted to pay that debt back in some way, and public service and politics was a part of it. But like I said, I wanted to see this. I wanted to see the stars. I wanted to go to the moon, and I ended up, traveling the world, which is great. That's the closest thing in my view. And what I've learned, Shaman, is the farther you travel, the more you see, the more appreciation you have for home, despite its imperfections. And our country is the greatest country in the history of the world, but it's definitely far from perfect.
That is a true statement. And one thing I really want to touch on is that your parents having to be to get here through refugee camps, knowing what their dream for what could be their lives here in America, like how are they feeling now with what's going on in the country?
Yeah, it's complicated. So my parents, when they came here, they came here largely because they had a respect and admiration for the American troops they were supporting during the war, right? And when they landed in California, they had nothing, and they started a pretty small gardening company. And actually, my first job was working for them at 8 years old. I was mowing lawns. And it was a fairly affluent neighborhood because that's the only way you get to decent public schools in America. And so that was a strategic decision on their part. But for me, it was an important lesson. It ties into sort of the family connection to the world because you learn quickly, Shaman, when you're the help, you're treated not so good. And that was an important lesson to learn at 8, that not everyone is treated equally, despite the fact we're all human beings on planet Earth, right? And my parents, told me at 10, when I was really getting more interested in politics, I was watching a presidential debate, at that time. And I was just so fascinated with how smart people were. And I was like, gosh, I want to be in politics. And my mother said to me, she says, son, just because you're an American citizen doesn't mean people think you're going to be American. So be careful. You don't want to stand out too much, because if you do, people are going to put you in your place. And I remember, and the story that I unfortunately talk about the first time I experienced racism, and this will tie to my parents in a sec, but it's important to note, was my interest in running for class president in 5th grade. And I was determined, 35 kids, I think I can get 18 votes. I do the math. I can do some math. I can do that. I was going around canvassing for votes, and one of the boys came up to me and was like, listen, people like you, but they're not going to vote for you because, everybody knows you eat dog. I was like, eat dog? Why would I eat dog? I have pet dogs. Why would I eat a dog? It seems also that's very stringy. Like, why would that make any sense? And after lunch, I came back to my desk after playing basketball with the boys, and lo and behold, there was a drawing of me, looked like me, eating a dog. And I was just so crushed because, whatever you call your dreams, that was the first time I realized that actually not everyone wants you to dream. And that things like that, those things don't just happen. Those things are taught. Those things are conditioned. Those things are created. And so why does that matter to how that connects to my family, right? So not too long after that experience, a few years later, they moved to southern Georgia. They run a free-range organic chicken farm down there. And it's important because, when you have a communist government collectivizing your 5th-generation rice farms, right, you kind of want people to get out of your stuff, understandably. And they figured southern Georgia, great land, great opportunity, free-range chicken, they're Buddhist, it's perfect, right? And they cultivated relationships there for 20 years. And during the height of COVID-19, there were 3 places in the world that had the worst COVID outbreak. The first was in Rome, in Italy. The second was in New York City, as you know. And the third was southern Georgia. There had been an outbreak in these 5 counties down there from a funeral, about 20 minutes away from my parents' farm. And over the course of those few months, and obviously the country was going through a weird funk, as you recall, but they noticed that the friends that they had built relationships with, the folks they did business with, the people that would check in on how they're doing, weren't coming around very much. And it wasn't because of the virus. And, around August, they said, hey, we can't spend time with you because you're the reason why the virus is here. Right. So enough propaganda had come into place to realize that Asian Americans were the reason why this was here. And so to answer your question, right, when my parents were on the phone with me that August, to hear them, despite their own willingness to pretend that they could be American enough, they bought into it just enough to be crushed in the way that I was crushed when I was 10. So, the American dream is a complicated thing. The way I describe it to folks is the American dream is not the people who get here. That's not actually the American dream. The American dream is what their kids can do and the opportunities that their kids will have that they never will. And that's the God honest truth. And to be able to have the life experience they got to have was because of their sacrifices and the hard work they had. And they really believed if they worked hard enough, if they were quiet enough, if they were, laughing at the jokes enough, they'd be accepted here and they would be American. But despite having 20 years with a community of people, and despite trying to give back, and despite trying to invest in the local economy, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. And that their standing was conditional, was arbitrary, and was decided by other people that weren't them. So in America in 2021, it's a complex time. But for Asian Americans who are actively being targeted, you've probably seen videos of mainly grandmas being beaten up on the street or a bus, while worst of all, while people were watching, not doing anything. That's alarming. And if you look at history, bad things tend to happen, but more bad things happen when good people don't do anything. And that is very much what America has been and is moving towards. And that's what inspired me, honestly, to speak up, to speak out, and to be speaking with you today. You know, being in politics, actually the last thing you want to do is talk to the media. The last thing you want to do is get out there. You want to just do the work and kind of do your thing.
Right.
And, for me, I realized that if I didn't say something, I would be a part of that complicity too. And I think that was the case last year too with Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd and many, many others. And you and I know this. That's 400 years of stuff. That's not new.
Right.
And I will also tell you, in terms of Asian hate, that's not new either. No. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States have been here since the 1850s. And they've had laws directly targeting them for their legality. The U.S. government has interned groups of people during World War II. You might recall the Japanese were interned during World War II. Do you recall German Americans or Italian Americans being interned?
No.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, there's a history of this.
And see, you bring up a couple of things that I definitely want to touch on. One of the things that always has irritated me, your parents, my parents, we are American. Mm-hmm. Our ethnicity is on our face. So we should not have to indicate when we talk to you that, oh, I'm an African American or I'm an Asian American, because we are the only subset of Americans that need to qualify who we are. We don't do German American. We don't do Italian American. We don't do Swedish American. This is a melting pot. And we have all races here, but it seems to be the only ones that are visually different, which it seems very backwards that you'd have to qualify that if it's already on your face, what and who you are. Yeah.
And I think it highlights the fact that, race is also, it isn't just a physical thing, right? It's also identity, right? And that's very complex, right? You can be half something, right? Like I have a 1-year-old. She's half Asian. Okay. I think she's going to be looked at as Asian because she looks Asian, but maybe she might not consider herself Asian. Right. I have no idea yet. Right. Yeah. Frankly, just because you look a certain way doesn't mean you have any idea where someone's really from. Right. I mean, especially, for example, with Black folks. Right. I mean, Black folks are from everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got non-white Jews from everywhere. You've got so many groups that it's so easy to shortcut incorrectly. I think it's hard because in our societies, we want to sort of do these shortcuts because it sort of makes it easier for us to better put people in boxes. The problem with the boxing is the issue, right? That shortcutting is like on a foundation that is, again, 400 years of racism and oppression, right? So those aren't the best practices to use per se. Here's the thing though. And this is why it's so important, especially in the era of Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate, and at least was for me, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, but, I spent my entire life running away from being Asian. Now, some of that was cultural, right? My parents telling me, like, do not stand out, right? Part of it is because they were worried we'd get killed. Part of it was also because they knew you had to go along to get along, right? To do business. It's part of the deal, right? But it was also the case that I found that the more apple pie I was, which I loved apple pie, and the more baseball I was, which I love baseball, the more I fit in, whatever that means, right? And if you look at like one's career or one's achievements, it's all about sort of being in the flow, right? And if you're seen as an outlier, you'll be treated like an outlier in a generally negative way, right? We talk about how it's important to be innovative and unique, but actually, we secretly want some sort of commonality, right? We want to focus on the commonality rather than the difference. But the truth is, the difference is what makes the United States the greatest country in the history of the world. If you look at all the great achievements, it comes from people coming from everywhere who've invested their intellectual horsepower, their, godly passion in creation, and their commitment to man and woman. That is actually what has made it special. And a place that then accepts them, regardless of whatever persecution they had in their previous generation or life. That is when we're at our best, right? So, when we have folks that come here from different countries to then serve as doctors in rural communities, right? Like in Virginia, where you are, right? Or if we have small business owners who are opening up shop in places that desperately need commerce. And when we have a massive virus, the worst in 100 years, you need research and development, brain power from immigrants to help create a vaccine that will save your life and my life and many other families' lives, right? That's the power of difference. And when you don't embrace the things that make you unique, that are not part of that cultural connection, if you're not connected to that, it's always like you're typing with one hand. You can get the words down, but you're never speaking the way you really need to. You're not saying what you really mean saying. And last year, and we talked about this, when I did sort of have this aha moment about, okay, I'm actually Asian, right? Despite my efforts to try to pretend to be white. That's when I really felt like I was truly whole, truly myself, and then also truly ready to do something bigger than myself.
And I'm glad you're saying so many things that now looking back on my youth when, because I'm an Army brat, so I've always been around.
You're from everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
I was always accustomed to meeting people, families of different ethnic groups. And now I'm looking back on it because I've had plenty of like Asian friends as a child. And now I'm looking back on how they always they were accepted in our groups, but they never tried to be like, to stand out. They were more inclined to just being in the background, just being part of the group was enough.
They were happy to be there.
Right.
They were grateful to be a part of something. Right. That's what you're saying.
Right. And I would always wonder, and it seems like it's very prevalent because, like I said, now when I actually give these things thought, like it was easy to make Asians the butt of jokes, and no one would ever say, "Hey, man, that's and I would see like Asian people, and they would just take it on the cheek. On the chin.
They would laugh.
Yeah, and
they would laugh. We'll make a joke.
That wasn't really funny though. Like you can have, I always say this: you can have jokes that are racial without being racist. However, when you know something is blatantly racist, it's more apt to see like an Asian man or woman just to not bring too much ruckus, not raise their voice, and just kind of take it and move on with it, like water off a duck's back. And I was just always, is that something that's like just naturally ingrained, or I don't know. So, and that's why I love speaking to you, because I want to know about these things.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could speak for all 7% of the United States. It's first off, right? I mean, the Asian American Pacific Islander community. It's multiple communities, right? It's let's say 50 ethnicities, 100 languages. Let's just say ballpark. That's a mosaic, right? A kaleidoscope of people. It's harder to sort of bucket. And actually the data reveals that, which we'll talk about data. But deep down, there are a few commonalities, one of which is this deeply ingrained cultural aspect, right? That you talked about, like this very strong sense of group cohesion, and that, you should be grateful. Absolutely. 100%. And like, let your busy bee work show your value. So let your output be the value rather just than being valuable, period, for being who you are. Right. That's very different. And I think it's very different than many cultures, to be honest. Right. But to your point about the jokes, yeah, you're conditioned very early on to have jokes ready. And I'll give you an example, from a few examples. I'll give you one from from July. Okay, so not too long after 4th of July, I went out for meetings. I had some work meetings here in DC, and I was walking out. So suit and tie, okay, which is the worst in the summer. It's not fun. And these two guys go up to me, and they're like, "Hey, Buddha, can we rub your belly for good luck?" And here's the thing. I know it looks like Shaman. I know it sounds like a bizarre question, but actually it's not a bizarre question for me because I've had this question before. So I know the answer. So I go, "Hey, listen, guys, I got to tell you something. I'm not a genie. So if you rub my belly, I don't have wishes to give. So sorry." And like, that's the best way for me to handle it. And I have to say this, as a man, I can say that. As a woman, totally different ballgame. If you're a woman here, you might be beaten up or killed in public. And we have to talk about the differences.
Yeah.
There. So I'm going to say it from a straight Asian dude perspective, right? Who's had to deal with this, who's been spit on before, who's had, who's been called chink and other stuff and told to go back to where they come from. And that isn't California, right? Like these sort of things.
Yeah.
And then I'll give you the second example, which is what really sort of had me thinking about these issues, right? So last March, I was flying for my last work trip before COVID-19 really like unbuckled the country. And I was in an airport, and I'm trying to get to San Francisco. So I'm again, suit and tie, coming out of my work meeting. I'm hauling, and I get through security, and this woman comes up to me, just beelines it right to me. And she just hawks this giant loogie onto my face. It's just going right down the cheek. And again, you're conditioned to hide your shame, to de-escalate the situation quickly, make everyone feel better. Because there's about a dozen people who see this, okay? Including some security people, but that's neither here nor there. And what I said was, because this is not the first time it's happened to me before. So I had an answer, which was, gosh, if I knew it was going to rain, I should have brought an umbrella. And that's exactly the reaction you should have, the one you're having, which is, there's no words for that, right? Yeah. But as you were just pausing, you know what those other people were doing? They had already forgotten about it. Not their problem. Walked away. Didn't care. I didn't matter. Not their problem. And that's what happens when good people let the bad stuff happen, is that you are complicit in the bad things. That is the big issue, right? If you're talking about allyship and this sort of thing, pretty basic premise. Like, I want to believe in the golden rule, right? That, you treat others like you treat yourself, treat your family, that sort of thing. But in that situation, like, people there made an active decision. They made a bucket calculation that what happened to me wasn't very important, and that my standing as an American, as an Asian American, again, was arbitrary and conditional, despite the fact that I'm told I'm the best minority, by the way, which we can talk about that too, the model minority lie thing. But so let's just say I am the top minority, okay? Let's just say I am. Well, not there. Not there. I was less than human, right? And being spit on sucks, but that's not the issue. The issue is when people bless the bad things. That is the issue. And that's when I realized that I needed to start saying something. And so for months, I was trying to figure out, like, how do I do that? I have no idea, right? But then when my parents called me up about what they were told, that they were the reason for this virus, thousands of people were dead because of them, that their lives were ruined, that's when I was like, I need to write something, right? So I remember writing in my little local paper, the Albany Herald. So it's 3 hours outside of Atlanta. And I wrote this piece about the contribution of immigrants, like we just talked about, during COVID-19. And two things happened. One, it was actually pretty well read. It was a Sunday piece. It got a lot of traction, despite the fact that it's from a local paper, because who the heck actually reads local papers? Who the heck actually reads, right? I would just go on the TikTok and be good, right? But no, people read it. Second thing, whole town read it. Whole town knew what I was talking about. Whole town knew me as their son, who works in those shiny office jobs, right? That's how they think of me. Right. And they did something that was wholly surprising, which is they apologized to my parents. So then I realized, Shaman, that if you speak with passion, if you speak with truth, if you speak with fact and evidence, and with convincing and evincing ruthlessness, if you speak like that, I think people are forced to hear it, right? They're forced to confront it. And that's what I started doing. So it's been almost a year. It's been almost a year and 2 weeks, right? So August. I've had about 40 pieces that went all across the United States, some of which you just talked about. And I found that there was this world of people waiting to see what they should do. And that if I wasn't going to say it, someone else was, but it might all have been me. Because again, I felt this responsibility, right? We don't have a choice anymore. It's either you're racist or you're anti-racist. That's it, right? And I was like, I need to make a stand here, right? And I just found so many people. This is what I call the halo effect. And I definitely want to talk about this part in your life as well, Shaman. When I started writing and started speaking about these issues, and really not just about Asian hate, but about issues of social justice, issues of how the government should be supporting the most vulnerable. So rural community members, veterans, as you know from your family's experience, not an easy life, women, other communities of color that have had huge challenges during this horrible pandemic, who, by the way, during this pandemic got screwed way worse. So let's be real. I found just so many people wanting to talk more or speak more or have more questions. And that created this interesting halo where I saw other people that I knew through friends of friends starting to write or starting to ask questions or starting to acknowledge that they're not white either. So, I write for three audiences, Shane. I write for political decision makers, because at the end of the day, they're in chairs, our leaders, and they make decisions that affect people's lives. And I'm proud to say that people read that stuff and we have conversations. It's very cool. That's something I didn't really anticipate, right? The second is I write for, a general public, but, a general public that also focus on communities of color, because as you know, when you talk about model minority, when you talk about white supremacy, there's such a natural instinct to create wedges between different groups of people needlessly and also disingenuously. It's important to have that conversation across races and cultures. And three, speaking to other Asian groups, because Asians are some of the biggest proponents of, or biggest sort of implicit supporters of model minority lie. And so they lie to themselves to say like, oh, and we can be white enough, right? And the joke is you care about three things. And when you're in this group, it's you care about your kids' schooling, you care about, making your mortgage payment, and then climbing the corporate ladder. And that's it. And when this past March, when women of Asian descent were murdered at these spas in Atlanta, it really shook people. And my family, my sister in particular, lives about 20 minutes away from one of those spots. And I got hundreds of messages, saying like, are you guys okay? What's going on? And some of those messages also became messages from Asian friends, the most apathetic Asians I know, who were asking questions like, where should I give money? Who should I talk to? What letters do I write? What can I do? Because this obviously isn't going away. So it was this like interesting aha moment. And now it took horrible murders and tragedies of these women's lives for people to have this awakening. And I should preface this saying that these acts of violence and hate have always been around. It's just there's more social media to capture that. And when I say awakening, I'm talking about a more broad awakening. There have been Asian American activists for quite some time, and that deserves its own kudos. But when the apathetic ones are engaged and passionate and ready to roll, that's very different. Very, very different than, your woke fighter from the 60s,
Right. That's one of the things, like, as you're like speaking on right there, like the model minority.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, speaking from a Black experience, it seems like you're trying to make the other side feel comfortable with you being there. Like I said, I'm like I'm 6'3". I'm a pretty big guy, and I kind of, lower my, like, try to shrink myself.
Shrink.
Try,
Yeah, you slouch, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it was one of those things, like like you said, I had like this my own aha moment is like, I can't make you be comfortable with me.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be comfortable with you,
Yeah.
and that's where it really starts, is with the individual themselves. Until America itself really takes a good hard look at itself and realizes how it came to be and how it truly needs to come to atone for its past sins, we still will never correct the situations that we're in, because we're always trying to put these Band-Aids over bullet wounds, and we're constantly bleeding.
Well, I mean, that's why there's a quote unquote controversy about, education right now, right? About, I guess they call it critical race theory. Sort of what I would call it is an honest acknowledgement of really horrible things.
Yeah.
And that, you can still be proud of your country and understand that its history is very dark.
Yeah.
And if you look at the 1619 Project, for example, right? The talking about the story of America. The story of America cannot be decoupled without talking about the story of slavery and the story of, our original sin, right? It's such you to your point, like the Band-Aids over the bullet wounds, it's exactly that. And, people are, some of the, the critics of this thinking are concerned that people will have their feelings hurt, or that, it's not a fair assessment or judgment. But, last time I checked, there was a civil war over this stuff. Last time I checked, it wasn't like people were truly emancipated and freed, like truly, and it is so fascinating, tragic, but fascinating to see how many people continue making themselves feel better and looking at you and me, where you and I need to accommodate them when they need to be looking within themselves. Right.
Correct. It's really, it's gotten to the point of a frustration, and these are the things that people really don't understand. Is like they don't get, like, why now? Why are they so vocal now? Why are they so angry? Because all of us have been saying these things. We have been saying these things, but we've only been talking. We haven't
nicely, very nicely,
and no one's here. So now we have to bring a hammer, because we need to get your attention. Like, these are things that are very important. I cannot allow myself to see any minority, any protected group just being ridiculed and do nothing and say nothing, because the longer that none of us say anything, nothing ever changes. Like, we have to be a vocal group if we want to enact change. We have to go out here, talk to politicians, vote, use your votes, find out about the people that you are putting in office, and understand where their true heart lies. That only then will we enact change.
Yeah. And also, change is something within, right? Change is also an active decision to how you live your daily life, right? A commitment to being anti-racist, and a commitment to being a community member, an active community member, is not an easy thing. This isn't all supposed to be roses and rainbows and unicorns, right? It's not. It's really hard. But to your point, history has a way of, I don't think history repeats itself, but history definitely rhymes. And there's a lot of rhyming that's going on between now and, let's say, the 60s, right? There's just this sort of interesting time that's very tumultuous. You have a lot of extremism. You have a lot of disinformation. You obviously have the backdrop of, some aspects of American imperialism overseas. Like, it's a very complex time. Like, that's why people are scared, right? They're scared because there's so much change happening. Add in globalization and add in the power of information and technology to that mix. Wow. Like, you have something at high speed, right? High speed uncertainty is what you have. And what I've learned is, and I know you as well, is people act really weird in times of uncertainty. But to your point, disrupting a system that is purposely built to hold you down. You look at the history of that, everybody does. Everyone ends up fighting that. Everybody. At some point, people can feel the shackles, whether they see them or not. That's a separate thing. They can still feel them every day, right? The same shackles in your daily life where you have to slouch down and I have to make a joke after I've been spit on in a public place, right? It's the same things. And we have to sort of just take confidence and faith. And this is why it's important that you and I are talking today about why we have so much to learn from each other, to do good together, to work together, to fight the bad stuff out there. And the worst stuff is the everyday stuff. You know, the worst stuff is when you and I are walking together and for whatever reason, someone sees us and they walk on the other side of the street, you know? Yeah. It's that thing, you know, it's the thing where people are walking by and, the person clutches their purse a little tighter, you know, those little things. I feel those things. I know you do too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so bizarre to me because there's no need to feel that way. And like, honestly, in this country, and you don't really understand psychologically what that does to a person and to a people. It puts them in a space of self-shame, know, where you're always 100. Looking at yourself as like, I'm the enemy or I'm the bad guy.
No. And it's hard too, because then there's these moments in our culture where we see something and again, it seems like it's not a big deal, but it really, like, we really do know better. And I'll give you a recent example, right? A Green Bay Packers player, recently made some comments to the press that, he didn't like the masks because, he wants to see people's faces and he didn't want the eyes to be as chinky. Now, just like big picture, like the chinky word, like that word is like the number one bad word in the Asian lexicon, right? It's like the equivalent of other not so good words that you should be using, right? That one is not good. And the thing, again, what I found so fascinating about that was, this was a very educated, very successful leader on a team, of a very notable team for the most coveted sport in our country, saying these things. And that's one thing that's pretty peculiar. But the second thing actually that I found peculiar, if you listen to the clip, is just how quiet the press were after. That they didn't know how to react, or like didn't think it was a thing, or they had to double check, right? It was so interesting because it's like, when you see something, like, we don't have to see, it's not like we have to see something, say something, we don't have that for whatever reason on Asian slurs. No. Right. We don't, right. Like, we're still kind of feeling that out. Right. For whatever reason. I mean, a notable soccer team, one of the most popular soccer teams in the world, Juventus.
Yes.
The women's team, one of the women's players, decided to fashion a cone on her head in the form that looked like a rice hat, and then did a little slanty eye thing. And, Juventus apologized, of course. And again, the fascinating part isn't the fact that this person, who probably knows better, but still decided to do it for whatever reason, unprompted, and who decides to post that. But if you look at the, like, oh, you're good, like, okay, we accept your apology, it's all white people. Yeah. It's like accepting the apology. It's like, oh yeah, well, that's great. Everything's fine now. So it's like, Shaman, it's like we don't even get to take part in the apology either. No, it's like such a fascinating thing.
It's one of the, it's just like, okay, we don't even have to say so to say, oh, okay, that was enough. We accept your apology. It's like, no, that should be good enough for you. They acknowledged it. You should accept
it. Amazing.
Like, no,
I know.
That's not.
I know.
No.
Yeah, and again, these are role models for, as you can imagine, American football, pretty big in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And then European soccer, pretty big, right? So these are leaders in their communities that have a global platform. And they, for whatever reason, have decided to have this judgment to say and do these things in jest, because it always is in jest, right? And as you and I both know, there's a truth to every joke, right? In that aspect, especially when the joke is like meant to be kind of harmful, like deep down.
Yeah.
And imagine all those boys and girls who want to play in the NFL or want to play in Serie A, right? Think about that. Think about the millions of kids that, when they were my age, right, when they were 10 years old, that had dreams, and then someone told them that they don't actually get the dream. And instead of a drawing of, a boy eating a dog, it's a caption on social media of a professional in one of the most important, influential professions on earth, telling these folks that their culture is a joke, that they're a joke, and they don't matter. What does that mean?
And that takes us right to like the propaganda around COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. The biggest thing for me that I truly could not understand is how, just because the origins of something happen to be from a particular country,
mm-hmm.
why does that make the people of that country bad? It's the virus. It's not the people.
Yeah, it's really interesting. First, again, there's sort of that shorthand, and when you have a former president of the United States calling it the Kung flu and the China virus, words matter.
Yeah.
The reason why words matter is because words are a signal, especially words from leaders, because then it signals that this is okay, right? Just like these professional athletes did these things, that signals that it's okay. It creates norms and values and an acknowledgement of a group being lesser than another, right? What is fascinating is that for whatever reason, the origins of this virus also now, it isn't just a country or one particular culture, right? It's a continent. It's a continent of people too, right? Never mind, I'm Vietnamese American, right? And I will just tell you without sugarcoating it, the Vietnamese and the Chinese, had a complicated history, just like many other countries in the world. They're just complex histories. That's the way it works, right? You can find that in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, Europe, wherever. Complex history. So when I am told to go back to China, my answer, because again, it's a joke, my answer is, I had to say the food is really good, but it's a really long flight. So I don't know. I mean, I'd love to go back, but it's long. And that's like my way of having to deflect a situation, because the alternative is to take it on. And here's the thing, as as a person of color, if the authorities show up, they will shoot one of us. It's not going to be the person who made the joke. Okay. I want you to picture that. I think you might know a thing or two about that. So you have to make that decision, especially, and for me as a father, I look at that decision very differently now, and again, you and I are speaking because words matter. Like, we're trying to explain this perspective and tell a story. And I'm so proud that you and I can talk about these issues because, in some of our cultures and some of our communities, like there's, been this appropriation that for whatever reason, Blacks and Asians aren't cool. And that's so the furthest from, right? One of my favorite tropes, I'll share one with you, is, there was a rash, as in New York City, of basically old Asian ladies getting the crap kicked out of them. And people would highlight in the video, oh my gosh, that person is Black. It's oh, see, look at this. Never mind that, if you actually looked at the data, more than 3/4 of the horrible acts of hate were actually, done by white people. No surprise. And also never mind that there's this complexity with mental wellness either. That's a separate conversation. But they take this one thing and they use it, they weaponize it to divide us and then make it sound like it's truth. And then somehow our communities go, oh yeah, because of, and then they have to, go back in time and try to figure it out. Oh yeah, the LA riots. They go back to 1992, which 1992 was a long time ago, right? Things have changed. I'll give you one more piece of data because it's important, and then I want to dig in. During, after George Floyd's murder, Pew had data out on support for Black Lives Matter. And at that time, the record highs, right? Especially among white people, because I think the white people were feeling bad. But also, but Asian Americans were number one on that list for most support. And then a year later, they had a return of that same survey, and Asian Americans still towards the top. So, Black struggle is Asian struggle, and Asian struggle is Black struggle. And that goes back to the 60s when, you did have more militant groups. You had Black Panthers, but you also had the Yellow Peril. You had people coming together to fight against these broader cultural imperialisms here, right? Because they recognize it wasn't right. And also because colonialism rhymes, right? Colonialism rhymes. And I think it's just so important for, our listeners here to understand that any sort of implicit sort of commentary that's Black and Asian, they're not cool, is total garbage, broadly speaking, and that we are fighting for so many of the same things. It might be done differently. It might be said differently. The leaders might have different ways of expressing themselves, but it's a rainbow coalition, absolutely. And we're way stronger together fighting this structure and system than we are divided, because divide and conquer that benefits other groups, not you and me.
Absolutely. Like I said, we are all human. We all have shortcomings to us all. So you do have moments where we aren't our best towards each other, but more often than not, Black, Asian, Latin American, we have all found companionship and sense of belonging with each other, and that's from the East Coast to the West Coast to the South. We've always been able to find each other and find a commonality in our differences.
Yeah. I mean, and I would include, indigenous groups, right? Native American communities that, again, history of genocide here, kind of know what's up, and live that struggle every day. But you're right. We have way more in common than we don't, right? And that's the truth, including the love of our people and the love of country. It's just, we've sort of acknowledged that there needs to be more to be done, right? And that if you don't see something, people don't do something, right? Just like we were talked about earlier. It's like that. It's like being a bystander, but in our discourse, right?
Right.
You either sort of don't take part or you do, right?
And that brings up another thing with your history in politics. What were you able to see on the inside? That's the one thing I'm roadblocks. I'm sure there were roadblocks.
There were. Like any industry, there's good things and not good things. I would just say that. But the reason why I think talking about politics is interesting right now is I think there's this that in politics, and you're in service to the country, you are sort of in some sort of elite group, and that maybe certain rules of certain things don't apply to you. And I did honestly think at some point that by being in politics and working for certain people, that I was to some degree immune from discrimination. I really did think that deep down. I really did. So when I worked in the United States House of Representatives, or when I worked at the United Nations, or when I worked for the governor of California, I honestly thought that I was an equal player, and that I could do things and make good things happen, with the support of peers and having the best ideas. I really thought that. And having really great ideas and working your tail off, absolutely important. That's in any industry. But in politics in particular, there are definitely some roadblocks. And you have to understand, Asian American and Pacific Islander political participation in this last election cycle were historic numbers, right? They helped decide the election in a number of states, including in the state of Georgia, where my family lives, right? So Asian turnout really did decide things. And it's a group of people, even though it's 7% of the country, it's the fastest growing. And also a group that are the newest entrants in politics. And did you know in the last cycle, just over half of them were contacted by either party? So you had a whole group of people that people didn't even bother. Now, some of that is because of, English language proficiency. Some of that is cultural barriers. Yes, that has to be acknowledged. But the strategists in these rooms didn't even think they were worth the time either to invest money in the engagement and outreach, right? Never mind that you have, Asian Americans participating in faith communities or in community organizing or other groups and other connections within, the spaces we live and breathe. Never mind that. But that's at people's peril, because this group of people also don't owe anyone anything, which is a fascinating thing. Fascinating. And in the recent cycle, the vast majority of Asian American groups. So let's say Lao Americans, Burmese Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans voted for Biden and the Democrats for the most part, by over 50+1. Now, some of that you could say was fueled by anti-Asian sentiment from the former president. Some of that might be because of policy questions. Some of it might have been racial justice, actually. Now, it's complicated for me because there's one significant outlier. The only group that were still actively voting for President Trump at the time were Vietnamese Americans. And I am a Vietnamese American. And there's reasons for this. The way I describe it, and forgive the shorthand, it's like the Cuban Asians. So, they're sort of outlier group. They come from a complex history, a very anti-communist sentiment, as we talked about. So that I see the connection. And also, frankly, living a history that no longer exists, right? It's, my parents fled the country. And when my parents go back to Vietnam to see friends or to reconnect, it's no longer their country. Like that, to them, it's just it's a place, but it's not what they had. So it's a sense of loss too. And many Vietnamese Americans, voted for President Trump because he was quote unquote hard on China. And there's a historical rivalry there, but also because they're so anti-communist, they want to be a part of winners. It's a really interesting dynamic. But in politics, that's like on the engagement side, right? It's just important to highlight. But also the issue is actually Asian Americans in politics, in the business of politics. There's so few. So, the United States Congress has, let's say, 20-something Asian members, AAPI members. There's only about 4 chiefs of staff in the U.S. Congress, the entire thing. So 435 House members, 100 senators, 535 elected officials. Only 5 chiefs of staff. So it's well below the proportion of the country in representation, right? That's pretty interesting because these are the folks that make a lot of decisions. And when I worked for the governor of California, I was, with only a handful of exceptions, the only Asian person in the room. Here's the thing though, right? The type of role I had when you're deputy cabinet secretary, and I'll just tell you a quick joke, but when I told my mom I was going to be helping to run the governor's cabinet, my mother said, "You know nothing about carpentry, though. You don't know how to make anything with your hands. You're terrible." And, for distinction for the guests here, the listeners, I mean, the cabinet side is the folks who run the day-to-day of government. And when the bill becomes a law, the law requires the government to do stuff. So I was on the do stuff side, right? So whether that was supporting agriculture issues or military affairs or the state's veterans, fires, floods, cybersecurity attacks, mass shootings, all the disasters I dealt with, privacy, technology issues. When you think of California, right, you think of it's 40 million people. It's the 5th largest economy in the world if it were a country. You think of Hollywood, you think of Napa, you think of Silicon Valley, right? That's all there. You also think about historic fires every year. You think about all that other stuff too. But when you get to run California, it has a global meaning. And that means that what you do there could affect a lot of people. 40 million people for California is the size of Canada by population. So just think of it that way. But within the business of politics in the States, despite the fact that California has 16% of the API community members in the US, only 12, 13 elected officials in Sacramento. It's like such an interesting dynamic. It's like, how does that happen? And even fewer in the staff levels, which in the role I had, what would happen, this is how it works, right, Shaman, is a group come into the meeting. You sit down, they raise concerns, you talk about it, and then you try to figure it out. That's the gist of what the work is, okay? You're problem solving in half-an-hour blocks. That's the way I would describe politics, okay? And then you try to figure out where the guardrails are, right? You're just trying to keep the bowling ball on the lane so you hit some pins, okay? That's real talk. That's what you're trying to do. Ideally, it's a strike. You hope it's a spare. Sometimes you're hoping it's 1 pin. That's all you're hoping for, okay? If you're better at it, you think you're going to bowl more strikes. But what I found was, and this is something I didn't realize, that when I was in the meetings, I found people were just really, you would think when you walk into the governor's office and you have a discussion, there's a degree of decorum, And I just found in my meetings, people were really hostile to me. I found that really weird. And I would ask colleagues, I'm like, hey, are people kind of like yelling at you and like kind of telling you that like they're going to go against their word after? Like, does that happen? And they're like, no, that sounds crazy. And I thought I was going crazy. I thought I was horrible at my job. And I many times wanted to quit. Because like, when you want to, when you're supporting the governor, when you lose, he loses. And that's not okay. It's like, think of it like he's the quarterback and you're the left tackle, right? Right. You're the guard, right? Or if he gets sacked, that's on you. You're supposed to protect the boss. You got to give him more time to throw the ball down the field, right? Because again, it's about TDs. It's about TDs here, points on the board. There's no points on the board if your quarterback's got dirt on him, right? And so I kept feeling like I was missing my target each time, right? That I was getting gutter balls. And so I decided, I was like, maybe I am having these issues, right? And I would, try to get advice from coworkers and, people that I reported to, and they say, maybe it's because you need to work on your leadership skills. Like, you don't speak up enough, and sometimes you speak too much, and sometimes you are too analytical, but sometimes you go with your gut too much. It was like very contradictory things. And actually, like a woman mentor of mine, I would tell her these stories and she would laugh and she'd say, that's exactly what women go through every day, right? So in some ways I was being treated like a woman, which was really interesting. But the other bit, and this is what she got to, is what I decided to do, Shaman, is in my meetings, I would take a colleague of mine that didn't look like me, and they would do the meeting with me. And I noticed two things happen. Number one, in every meeting I had, so this is despite the fact the person might not know anything about the subject or the group. Okay, they're just completely blind. They're doing me a solid. I've already offered some bevies for them to come. Okay, we do the meeting. We come in, and the people in the meeting assume that the person I brought with me is the one running the meeting, almost without fail, maybe 95% of the time. I think that's interesting. And then the second bit was that the deals that we hashed out were respected almost always, probably about 95% versus 10%, if I were to be honest. I want you to think about that. In politics, the most powerful thing is like the deal and then keeping your word because you cut a deal. That's the game. And I had an 85% difference, right? So obviously I was treated differently for some reason. And maybe it is because I was newer to politics, right? Like I didn't grow up in the business. Maybe that's part of it. But maybe it's because Asians weren't taken seriously, right? So that's like some like underneath the hood here. We're lifting up the engine. That's what it looks like. Again, you're just trying to get things done to move on because there's a crisis and a crisis and a crisis to deal with. And the faster you resolve something, the less you have to worry about compounding drama later. It's in your interest to move on. So if you have people agree to move on and then not move on, that looks really bad for you. Then you haven't done your job. Again, block your guy. Right? Block your guy, protect your guy. I wasn't able to do it until I had help on the blind side. Then I was okay.
Wow. Yeah, it really seems like some murky waters to tread to try to get things done.
Yeah.
Say people are like actively out there undermining what you're trying to accomplish. So,
yeah, I think that's like any workplace though. There's, people that are kind of jerks. Like there's a lot of that. Like, but I just wanted to say the reason why it was important for me to write about those experiences because people think, the people not in politics think that doesn't happen in politics. Like that you're treated differently because you're in these special groups, and it's not true at all. You're just in shinier offices, right? You're in older buildings, like talking about stuff, right?
That's the biggest thing.
We're still human in that process. And again,
people.
Very imperfect.
Yeah, people are still people. Like I said, it doesn't matter to the highest of us to the lowest of us. You will find an asshole if you look hard enough. That is the true statement.
Not hard to find here. You just have to throw a stone. You're gonna hit somebody.
So big picture outlook is like, what do you think we can do to actually enact some change?
Yeah, it's so hard. So I will say this, if you wouldn't mind, it depends who, right? So let's just say it's government. Let's say big government's going to come and help, right? At least among Asians in Pacific Islanders, I tell folks, and I recently wrote about this, that if the Biden administration and Congress are serious about doing stuff for this group of people, by the way, this mid-August, Stop AAPI Hate, which has been a civic group that's been collecting self-reported claims of hate crime, acts of violence, acts of discrimination, acts of harassment targeted towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Over 9,000 cases. 9,000 cases since the beginning of the pandemic. 9,000. Just for perspective, that's a 150% increase in the largest 17 cities in America. Okay. In California, right, the most diverse place on earth, really, hate crime was up over 100% for targeting Asian Americans. Now, it's true that hate crime in California was up 30% for everybody, but 100% on top for Asians is pretty serious. Again, this is where, Asian Americans have been the longest, right? Chinese, Japanese Americans came in 1850. So there's a long lineage, right? But also it was ground zero for the worst hate. About 40% of the acts of hate happened in California. So it's like, even in these progressive, diverse places, you still have this stuff happening, right? Because words matter, right? And so what I tell folks in the government, and what I've been talking about really, is if you're serious about protecting this group of people, you need to be more precise on who that is. And there are three groups that have been particularly screwed during this. And it's not a surprise for you, but it's usually the most vulnerable, right? So women, more than 2/3 of the cases have been perpetrated against women. Women are completely treated in a very horrible way in this country, but especially Asian women deal with that. And I recognize as a guy, right? That's what I was telling you. I make jokes because I get away with it. I don't think it's the same if you're an Asian woman making jokes. It's a very different ball game. And again, I am worried about being hurt, but most of my women peers are worried about being murdered. And there's cases that, like in Atlanta, for example, right? People are just trying to live their life. We need to support more women in that space. Women need to be having more directed services to them, especially since the women are the ones running the household, right or wrong. They're the ones also dealing with their kids being bullied at school. So don't be surprised if, when we return to school in the fall, that a lot of Asian kids don't go back to school because they're being bullied. Like I was bullied when I was a kid, right? Yeah. That's pretty common, right? Also, don't be surprised if the moms have to take care of the elderly parents. So this is the second group. Elderly parents, the seniors, right? The grandparents. They're the ones actively targeted. And those videos are all what you see, right? They know that. And so what they do, they shelter in fear and they don't go outside. And, a recent report found that they were twice as likely to not go outside to get food, even though they needed food, than white people. That's how scared they are. And if you look at the data, the number one place of danger for seniors is in areas of public transit or walkways, right? For women, it's also the number one place is areas of public transit. But number two is at the workplace. Some of the worst things happen in the workplace. So that ties into why you need to have the business community more engaged, which we'll talk about that in a sec. But the third group that you really need to support is small businesses. So Asian American Pacific Islander small business. So, during the pandemic, everyone got totally hosed, right? Horrible things. Most people's businesses didn't survive. And after the government was able to push out loans, right, for people, Asian businesses did the same. But here's the thing that's different than for their businesses is that there was a wave of vandalism. So all of this anti-Asian vandalism. So imagine you're a small restaurant or a small dry cleaner and your place gets trashed again. This is July, right? Just when we think the pandemic's over. So as the pandemic's and feeling like it's over, there's like more hate stuff. So actually in the Asian communities, there's two things they're worried about. They're worried about the virus, number two, and number one, they're worried about racism. That's like the racism are the way worse. right? And these businesses aren't exactly making bank here. They're just trying to survive. So imagine you just are about to get on your feet and then you have to deal with this unexpected expense. And by the way, the Delta variants come back. So you're also doubly screwed. So think about that, right? So the government needs to target and support those groups. In California, because they recognize just the size of how difficult the issue was, the state of California pushed out about $156 million of money. Some of that went to better management of data so that people can better report hate crimes. Some of that went to mental health and wellness services. Some of that went to ethnic media so that people can get more access in language. And some of that also went to projects to support places of Asian commerce. So like your little Chinatowns, your little Tokyos, your little Manilas, your Koreatowns, your Japantowns, that sort of thing, right? Because these are essential parts of people's daily life. And if you can't be protected there, or you don't have anything going on, I think bad things will happen, especially in public transit, right? So that's like the government part. I mentioned the business part, why that's so important. And businesses right now are interestingly having a hard time recruiting and retaining talent right now. That's partly because people realize in their life, like life's too short, right? After this pandemic, they call it the great resignation. That's going to be happening. It's like really interesting, right? And think about it. Like we had all this time to reflect on what's important in our lives, right? Probably working some crummy job with some boss you don't really like doesn't seem like number one on your list after surviving this thing, right? But Asian women, the amount of harassment they're dealing with or sort of discrimination is so significant. So companies have a responsibility to provide real, genuine commitments to diversity and inclusion. And when I speak to Fortune 500 companies about this, I try to tell them that, creating an environment that's inclusive is not that hard. You just have to try. And you need to put your money where your mouth is, right? So I tell folks a couple things, right? The businesses out there, especially the big ones, because they're the leaders, right? And if they do it, then other people do it. They need to find a way to get more women in the pipeline, just inherently, right? Recruitment and retention. Women make up 52% of the United States. And imagine, again, you're building a team, right, from scratch. You're going to the draft, but you just decided you're just going to draft dudes. How are you drafting? How are you going to build a franchise-winning team if you've already ruled out half the field for whatever reason, right? And the example I give to why that's so dangerous is in the place of sort of groupthink. An example I use from my tech life has been in cybersecurity. I was once part of a team that had people with very impressive credentials and education and background, and they were responsible for taking on cybersecurity hackers, bad guys, generally guys in this case. And guess what happened? They got their tails kicked almost every time. And it's largely because they all went to the same schools. They all studied the same thing. They had a similar worldview. They had similar life experiences. You know who the best people were at fighting bad guys when we were able to add in more non-traditional talent?
Had to be the ladies.
Definitely ladies. Absolutely. It's a combination of two groups. One is more ladies. And two was folks from communities of color who got into trouble as a kid. So folks, you know them, the ones that would take apart clocks and put them back together. The ones that looked like they were bored out of their mind at school because they were seen unmotivated, but the truth was they're just brilliant and nobody knows what to do with them, right? They come from tough homes, so it's part of it too. And then they get into a little bit of trouble with the law, first up, because again, they're really too smart for their own good. When they come out and they're able to get some appropriate training, they're the best at taking on bad guys, the absolute best, because they know how to think creatively and thoughtfully and with grit. That's what you need. So you need to have more women and people with more challenging life experiences to be able to be ahead of the curve against these bad guys. So that's an example where if you build a team that's more inclusive, you have a chance to win. Never mind the fact that it's been shown with studies that businesses that have more women and more people of color at the board level and at the C-suite level, deliver more wealth to their shareholders. It's just if you have these groups, you get more money. It seems like it makes sense, right? I love more money. That seems cool, right? The second thing that companies should be doing, besides opening their pipelines up, one of the things they could be doing is anti-racism training, right? Like the bystander training I talked about, the ones that make sure that you don't get beat up and I don't get beat up while people just watch. Two groups that do it for, in the AAPI space, but I think it applies to anything. One group called Hollowback, the other one called Asian Americans for Advancing Justice. They do really cool trainings to teach people about what they should be doing when they see that situation occur, right? To ensure that, you're not just watching something happen on the sidelines. So you're going to be an active participant to help somebody without escalating the situation in a way that's unhealthy for everyone. These businesses can do that. They should also be involved in, if they could, showing a screening, maybe a history, like they should learn the history. The PBS special, they have a thing on Asian Americans. I tell everyone to check it out. It's very comprehensive. It's very good. It tells everything soup to nuts. Highly recommend. And the last thing that some of these businesses should be doing, when people do DEI stuff or they have, this extra work, they should pay them. They should pay them for that work because it's real work. And then they should align the goals, the personal goals, to these issues. And then if the company isn't meeting those issues, they shouldn't give people certain parts of the bonus. That will probably incentivize them to work harder on it, right? Lastly, related to everyday people, right? You, me, others. Like, what could you do, right? The first thing I tell people is to actually ask someone about their family story. And unlike other groups, most Asians will just be so surprised you want to ask them something. I joke about it, right? I'm sure you talk about whenever some horrible thing happens to someone in the Black community, I'm sure you get bombarded with messages and you find it exhausting, right? For us, when horrible things happen, we're like, oh my God, you thought about us? It's a different concept. And not to make light of it, but it is different. Because again, we're like, we don't exist in the same way, right? In that space. And so just ask about someone's story. I find that just really important because if you understand that story, it makes a huge difference, right? And the other thing is that go support a business that's gone through this stuff, right? Just take your stuff to the cleaners once or twice. Go get your nails done. Go to the restaurant. Do takeout, whatever. Do you know how much that can make a difference for somebody? Especially when, again, it's places of work where people are having the discrimination, not to mention all the crazy people that don't want to wear masks, right? Think about it. The amount of harassment, as after my gardening job with my parents, I worked in retail and I worked in restaurants, and I think everybody should work in a restaurant because then it humbles you very much so. I think if I had to mandate anything, that would be a really good one. And that would probably teach human beings how to treat each other better.
At least a year in customer service.
Yeah, absolutely. Go work at Target, whatever. They'll teach you a lot, not just about folding clothes. They'll teach you a lot more than that. Absolutely. I tell people, just you can vote with your feet. Go back. And then lastly, you should go vote. To what you talked about earlier, Shannon, not just in the shiny year elections when the White House is on the line, actually in the local races. Because actually in the local races, like in your school board or like in your city council, actually they're making way more decisions that affect your day-to-day life, actually. Just in Virginia just recently, actually just a couple of days ago in August, one of the counties in Virginia, Northern Virginia, just passed, policies to support transgender students. So your vote does matter to be inclusive versus people who don't want to vote for that, right? So that shows to me the power of why representation matters locally. And especially if you can vote for someone who has a unique life experience or, there's someone who's pretty committed to an anti-racist world. This is a really powerful time to do that, right? And if you got a couple bucks, you should give the people too. But those are just some of the things that you, I, and everyone listening here can do. It doesn't cost them that much. Just time, just energy.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, thank you so much today. This has been a really great conversation. I hope you listeners out there have really been paying attention and taking on this information because, like Jeff was saying, it's really up to us if we want to enact these changes. Like, we have to be more proactive. We can't just be reactive to the things that we're seeing in our communities around this country. We have to go out. If you see something, speak up. Be that voice. I know it's difficult sometimes to get out in front of things, but if it's right and it's just, it must be done.
And I will say this: you only live once unless you're Buddhist or Hindu, so you better make it count, right? It is a great opportunity to live in this world, despite all the craziness. So I'm so thankful we could talk about these issues today.
Absolutely. Is there anything that you would like to leave with the listeners? Anything you want to plug?
Yeah, hopefully we can have it in the show notes. But I just recently had some commentary on local Fox 5 news here in DC on, unfortunately, hate crime that has been happening here in DC. So happy to plug that. And then I had a recent piece in Politico that talked about some of these issues we talked about. Would love to get it out there for people. You can follow me on Twitter, and I know we'll have that in the show notes. But thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, Shane.
Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I've been your host, Shaman, along with Jeff Lee. This has been No Room to Talk podcast, and I'll catch you next Wednesday. Peace.
thinking are concerned that people will have their feelings hurt, or that it's not a fair assessment or judgment. But last time I checked, there was a civil war over this stuff. Last time I checked, it wasn't like people were truly emancipated and freed, like truly, and it is so fascinating, tragic but fascinating, to see how many people want